What's up, AP people? This is chapter 22, Cultural Conflict, Bubble, and Bust from 1919 to 1932. We'll look at many domestic issues that the United States was facing at this time. You see them right here. We're going to go in depth into each and every one of them. We'll then move on and talk about the Harlem Renaissance, the Roaring Twenties presidents, the Roaring Twenties themselves, and eventually we'll end up with the Great Depression. This is a T-chart, more or less, how maybe you want to take your notes. I'm going to go one issue at a time. So first of all, we'll talk about the race riots. So after World War I, African Americans who returned home as veterans returned home proud being U.S. citizens and determined to be treated equally. The Great Migration, which was African Americans leaving the South and moving north in search of industrial jobs, better economic opportunity, better education, and equality, unfortunately led to conflict over jobs and housing with whites. And we see a newspaper here from the St. Louis Globe, where one of the worst race riots happened, that a mob of whites are shooting African Americans here. And you see the title, Negroes Shot, Burned, and Clubbed in East St. Louis. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And this picture here shows us a little bit of those cruelties that was happening. African Americans' neighborhoods in the North were looted, burned, and people were hunted down like animals. In the South, lynching also increased. So we see that African Americans are being pretty much harassed everywhere they go. There was over 25 race riots in major cities, mainly in the North. And like I mentioned earlier, in St. Louis, one of the worst race riots took place in 1917, where at the end of the race riots, 9 whites and over 40 blacks died. Many times the authorities were called in to try to help African Americans, but many times African Americans were actually victimized by these same authorities. Here we see an African American being burned with a pile of wood, and it seems like some people here are actually enjoying this. So it kind of gives you an idea of the racial issues that were going on in America at this time in the late 19-teens, early 1920s. So race riots was the first issue we were going to talk about. The next one is labor disputes. So that's what we have here, labor disputes. During World War I, labor unions actually won better wages for the workers, an 8-hour workday for most of the industries, and better working conditions. And as a result, union membership increased. So the unions actually had the upper hand during World War I because the government needed workers to work. After World War I, employers took the upper hand because they no longer needed as many employers as they did during World War I. So employers went and cut wages and broke unions. There's also a launch that was anti-union. Politicians and the Supreme Court further caused union membership to decline. And a specific example is this one, Atkins versus Children's Hospital, where the Supreme Court voted a minimum wage for women workers in Washington, D.C. So while the labor unions had won a better or a minimum wage for women, the Supreme Court said that that was unconstitutional. So we start seeing that in the early 1920s, a lot of these laws that the progressives passed to improve society are now being repressed by the Supreme Court in a Republican government. This newspaper caption is from the Cleveland Press. The date is September 22nd, 1919. It is a front page, and it is the first day of the 1919 steel strike, where steel workers are meeting in Brookside Park. Also, like African Americans were being harassed, steel workers were beaten by the police, federal troops, and the state militia. The employers then hired strikebreakers, and they started to link strikebreakers with communism. And I'll show you a political cartoon later that connects those two. Other industries that led to labor disputes, in 1919, over 4 million workers, which was 20% of the labor force at that point, went on strike, including Seattle shipyard workers, coal miners, steel workers, and the Boston police, which is what this political cartoon shows us. Notice this individual represents violence, he represents crime, and this one over here represents disorder. The Chicago Tribune, which was not in Boston, depicted the Boston police as the allies of all these group of people who represents chaos. So we realized that even the media was portraying strike breakers as something that was against law and order. Now, the Boston police went on strike because it had been 5 years since they had received a wage increase. Furthermore, they were refused the right to unionize, and when certain police force asked for a raise, they were fired on the spot. In retaliation, the rest of the Boston police went on strike. The Massachusetts governor at that point was Governor Calvin Coolidge. He fired the entire Boston police force and replaced them with a whole new set of police agents, showing that the federal government, or the state government in this case, is again intervening in people's civil liberties. So the government is playing a bigger impact and is trying to show that they are in control. The next issue that we're going to be talking about is the Red Scare. The Red Scare comes out of the fear of communism based on the Bolshevik Revolution that took place in Russia. And the color red comes to be associated with communism. So this political cartoon here again shows us a little bit. So obviously you see the American flag, and we have an individual here who is a foreigner from Russia. And we know that because he has a knife that says the Bolshevik, and he also has a torch that's trying to burn the American flag, which is anarchist. So communists were associated also with anarchism, people who want to get rid of all types of government. Now, in the United States, we do see a form of anarchism during the Red Scares, the beginning of the Red Scares. Reds, or communists, mail bombs to government officials, again, showing that they want to get rid of all forms of government. One of these officials was U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. He retaliates by launching the Palmer Raid. He arrested suspected communists, socialists, and anarchists. Many times it was just suspicion. There was very little evidence that the people that he was arresting were actually associated with communism. But he used it as an excuse to arrest people that were not conforming to his ideas. About 120 something foreigners were deported without trial. Many of the people that were arrested were also arrested without due process, the opportunity to defend themselves. And so it seems like Red Scare actually took it a step further and again was violating people's civil liberties. So this political cartoon, again from the Philadelphia Inquiry, tells us put them out and keep them out, meaning foreigners. So communists, the idea of communism led to some immigration laws that, again, I'll talk about in a little bit later. This political cartoon kind of brings together the last two themes, the labor disputes and the communism. So this locomotive represents American industry trying to move forward. Here we have a striker, some of these labor disputes, who is trying to stop American industries moving forward. So this striker now is associated with the Red Scare. Red flag is a symbol of of communism, and also foreign radical ideas. So if you were a striker, you were trying to stop, one, America's industries, and at the same time promote communist ideas, which of course did not fit well with the American public. Here we have another political cartoon. Uncle Sam is not looking very well at the world's melting pot. And what he's trying to do is trying to scoop out everything that is un-American, such as, notice here, the industrial workers of the world, the Bolsheviks, the red flag, the mad nations of Europe, and other ideas that were un-Americanized. So the United States was trying to filter out everything that they can consider un-American. So because of these two issues, in particular, communism, we have nativists. Nativists are American-born Protestants who, like Calvin Coolidge, believe that America should be kept for Americans. So these nativists blame U.S. social problems on foreigners and radicals, and they began to push for immigration laws. They were successful in passing a couple of them, first in 1921 and then 1924. The 1924 immigration law was called the Immigration Quota of 1924. It restricted immigration from European countries to 2% based on the 1890 census. And I'll explain that a little bit more in class. By 1927, there was immigration was limited to 150,000 people per European countries. These laws did not apply to the Western hemispheres. So people from Canada, about 1 million people from Canada actually entered the United States, and about 500,000 people from Mexico also entered the US. The reason they were allowed in was because the United States figured that if they did not want the Canadians or the Americans, it was easier to deport them than there was to deport European immigrants. So nativists had a big impact in immigration restriction. You see the political cartoon in the background? Here it is a little bit more. So this is a funnel that's bringing all these European immigrants over to the United States, crossing the Atlantic Ocean. And the only way to handle European restriction is by passing laws. So this was the 1921 law that I did not talk about, that limited immigration to only 3%. Again, by 1924, it limited immigration to 2%. And again, I'll talk about that more in class. But this political cartoon actually helps us understand a little bit more how Congress was trying to eliminate immigration. So all these are immigrants, and there are several of them that are labeled different. So here is an Irish pauper. Here is a Russian, I believe it says anarchist. Yeah, Russian anarchist. An Italian vagabond. An English convict. A German socialist. And again, a Polish vagabond. So the United States is looking at all these immigrants and it's trying to restrict how many immigrants they are allowing in. You see this paper here, it tells us that in New Orleans, there is a mafia. In Chicago, there are anarchists. And in New York, there are socialists, all people that the United States wanted to keep out. And so the United States is eyeing the immigrants to see which one they want to keep out. And again, that leads to the immigration quotas of 1921 and 1924. Now, this immigration also had a great impact. One of the unfortunate victims of immigration were Nicholas Sacco, a shoemaker, and Bartolome Vanzetti, a fish peddler. Both of them were from Boston. Now, they were Italian immigrants, and they considered themselves to be anarchists. During the war, World War I, they evaded the draft. In other words, they refused to go to war. In May 1920, both men were arrested for murder. While the evidence did not show that they were the people who actually committed the murder, the fact that they were immigrants and anarchists eventually persuaded the jury to convict them to the death row. Despite protests from not only the US, but across the world. And this is what we see here in this picture. Protest demonstration against death sentence. Everything, all the evidence pointed to these two men being innocent. But because of their immigration status and their political stance, they were eventually sentenced to die in 1917. An extreme example of what happens when extremists take charge of some political laws like the Immigration Act. We also have the KKK that resurges as a result of communist ideas and immigration ideas. The KKK began to target blacks, Catholics, Jews, and everything that is foreign. They were against alcohol consumption and unions. And a film entitled Birth of a Nation actually glorified the KKK during the Reconstruction era. So these were all causes that led to the resurgence of the KKK. And again, they caused a lot of chaos. This is a KKK march in some of these major cities. Now, in part because of them, that also leads to our next subheading, which is prohibition. The 18th Amendment bans the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Some of the causes of this was because religious individuals consider alcohol to be sinful. Reformers blame child and wife abuse on alcohol abuse. They also said that crime increased because of alcohol, and there was also an increase in accidents in the labor force. They were also hostile towards German American brewers, especially during World War I, and they believed that alcohol caused health problems and eventual death. Some of the effects was that alcohol consumption declined, which was to a certain extent good, but there was also a disrespect for law because people started to do bootlegging, smuggling alcohol, so they were mocking the law enforcement. This also led to organized crime and speakeasies, which was basically underground saloons where people went to drink alcohol. So there were some causes. These are some of the causes and effects of the 18th Amendment and prohibition.